Russians no longer want to remain in Crimea these days. The exodus from the peninsula has already begun. Following the successive attacks that occurred between June 19th and 21st, Crimean residents rushed to hastily pack their belongings. Here is one example of this situation from recent days. Russian citizens filling the train stations to leave Crimea have started questioning why they are even there. Yes, they are at the train stations.
God, why am I here? I want to go back to Moscow. I want to go back to Moscow.
This is because the Kerch Bridge was closed to traffic again for several hours following the recent attacks. The 4 S-400 radar installations responsible for defending the bridge, along with 2 Pantsir air defense systems, were successfully struck. This strike may have left the Russians with very little remaining operational window to safely use Crimea's most critical transportation artery. In the aftermath, Russian civilians were forced to wait up to 9 hours for the bridge to reopen to traffic. More than 700 vehicles formed massive queues while attempting to travel from Crimea toward mainland Russia in the direction of Krasnodar. It is claimed that waiting times at manual control points for crossing the bridge exceeded 2 hours. In other words, Russians are panicked enough to endure hours on the road just to flee from Crimea to Krasnodar. Ferry services are being cancelled one by one. During this period, 3 maritime vessels, including the Panagia ferry, were reportedly attacked. These ferries are among the vessels transporting military munitions and supplies to Crimea, primarily missiles and launch containers for S-300 and S-400 air defense systems. Consequently, the sea routes for leaving the peninsula have also been closed. However, despite the exit routes closing one by one, Russians have no desire whatsoever to stay in Crimea because they see that Putin's unsinkable ship is taking on water. Nor can they be faulted for this, because the war that Putin has stubbornly continued has spilled over significantly into Crimea in recent days, causing energy power plants, strategic fuel depots, and gas infrastructure to begin collapsing. The peninsula is step by step sinking into darkness. Fuel is running out, and it's increasingly being isolated from the Russian mainland. And in the last 3 nights, this isolation was elevated to a new and irreversible level. Ukraine struck Crimea's lifelines simultaneously. The attack wave began on June 19th and penetrated deep into Crimea's energy infrastructure. The Hlebivsky underground natural gas storage facility on the Tarkhankut Peninsula was attacked. This facility is a critical node that maintains pressure in the peninsula's gas network and balances seasonal consumption, and striking it directly weakened Crimea's gas transport capacity. 4 gas compressor stations across the peninsula were struck in succession, reducing pressure in the network. Without these stations, gas cannot reach end users. A locomotive in Rozdolne was disabled, disrupting intra-peninsula railway resupply. And the Rapaynik coastal surveillance radar station in Kamianska was destroyed, opening another gap in Russia's maritime and air awareness around Crimea. The first night was quiet, but devastating. It targeted the invisible but indispensable components of the energy network. The second night, attacks shifted to the visible face of the energy backbone. Around 2300 on June 20th, eyewitnesses heard drone sounds in the air. Then Russian air defense fire tore through the night's silence. Minutes later, a powerful explosion shook Simferopol. The target was the 470-megawatt Tavriska thermal power plant, the massive facility Russia commissioned in 2019 to ensure Crimea's energy independence. NASA's FIRMS satellite detected thermal anomalies consistent with fire at the facility, and dense black smoke rose over Stroganovka. Over the next 2 hours, explosions spread across the peninsula. Explosion sounds were reported from every corner from Simferopol to Sevastopol, and eyewitnesses reported smelling smoke. The Zhuravlivka gas distribution station near Simferopol, connected to the Jankoy-Simferopol pipeline and supplying gas to surrounding settlements, was struck. The TES fuel and liquefied gas storage terminal was also targeted and caught fire. The highway bridge over the Henichesk Strait was attacked. This bridge was a critical crossing point for transporting personnel and materials between Crimea and Russian forces in southern Ukraine, and striking it directly cut the southern supply line. The second night differed from the first. This time targets were large and visible, and power outages began across the peninsula. The third night was the heaviest blow. On the night of June 21st, Ukrainian drones were directed at Crimea in swarms, and this time the target was Kerch, the heart of the peninsula's fuel logistics. The TES Terminal 1, petroleum products and liquefied gas terminal at Kerch Port, was struck. Fuel tanks understood to be full, caught fire, and a massive blaze erupted. Kerch Maritime Port's industrial area was targeted. Positions of the 630th Railway Battalion attached to the 39th Railway Brigade were struck. Various S-400 radar elements and pantsir systems, including the air defense facility at Korotnoy, were destroyed. But the operation's most striking dimension was simultaneity. At the same time, Kavkaz Port on the Russian side of the bridge was also targeted. This port in the Krasnodar region was providing alternative supply via ferry when the Crimea bridge was restricted. Ukraine closed the exits by striking fuel infrastructure on both ends of the bridge simultaneously. A drone attack was launched on the Panagia ferry, and ferry services were suspended. At least 10 more explosions were heard throughout the night from the Sea of Azov direction in Kerch, and Crimea bridge traffic was shut for hours. When the 3 nights total emerged, the operation's scale became clear. Zelensky announced the attack struck targets approximately 300 kilometers from the front line, described them as long-range sanctions, and added, "Russia only understands power, and our long-range power serves peace." They understood the power because its results are felt by every Russian soldier and every civilian in Crimea. Approximately 60,000 Russian soldiers are deployed in Crimea, and this entire force stands on externally supplied resupply. A modern military force cannot function without fuel. Tanks and armored vehicles cannot move. Artillery batteries cannot change positions. Logistics trucks cannot carry ammunition. But vehicles aren't the only place fuel is used. Every military base, command center, and radar station in Crimea runs on generators, and those generators burn diesel. S-400 air defense system radars require uninterrupted power. If the radar goes off, air defense goes blind. Communications networks, drone control centers, and intelligence monitoring systems are dependent on electricity. After 3 nights, the main arteries of fuel flow were cut, and diesel to feed generators also became scarce. The result is a combined crisis: vehicles immobile, radars under threat, and the command control chain weakening. The destruction of 4 S-400 radars and 2 pantsir systems opened serious gaps in Crimea's air shield, and this creates a vicious cycle. As defense weakens, Ukraine's next attack becomes easier. The Black Sea Fleet's situation is also critical. Atesh resistance movement reported the fleet command has developed a plan to relocate from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. Magyar clearly identified this as a target. They plan to create conditions making it difficult for Russian military personnel to remain in Crimea. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry formalized this strategy as the Logistics Lockdown Program and allocated an additional $115 million to scale medium-range strike capacity. Military collapse swallowed civilian life too. This crisis is the most severe fuel crisis the peninsula has seen since the 2014 annexation. In late May, authorities had launched a weekly 20-liter gasoline coupon system. Coupons sold out the moment they were published on the official Telegram channel, and drivers waited in line for hours. After 3 nights, Aksionov completely halted all fuel sales at 9 a.m. on June 21st. Cash, transfer, and coupon included, for individuals and legal entities. Remaining fuel was reserved only for public services and security forces. Black market gasoline prices rose to 4 times the normal price. Authorities were forced to open an emergency hotline for stranded tourists. Kremlin spokesperson Peskov, with rare openness, acknowledged the crisis and said, "Measures are being taken." But war bloggers criticized the army harshly. They failed to anticipate the attacks, and the response was slow. The energy crisis is not limited to fuel. Following the strike on Tavriska thermal power plant, outages began in Crimea's northwest, central, and southern coastal electricity zones. Rolling blackouts were implemented in Sevastopol. The 129-megawatt mobile gas turbine plant in the Balaklava district was activated urgently, but proved insufficient. An electrical failure in Jankoy also hit water supply. Water began being given in 2-hour intervals. Power outages were also experienced in Armyansk, Alushta, and Krasnoperekopsk. All of this is happening in 30-degree heat. An advisor to occupation authorities suggested the public turn off air conditioning and unnecessary electrical appliances. Transportation also collapsed. Ferry services were suspended, and truck drivers were forced to use the land corridor hundreds of kilometers longer via Rostov, Taganrog, Mariupol, and Melitopol to reach Crimea. But that corridor is also within Ukraine's drone range. A Ukrainian commander described striking fuel trucks on the highway as hunting partridge in open field. 650 vehicles were stranded on the Crimea Bridge for hours, and only a maximum of 100 liters of gasoline can be transported per vehicle across the bridge. The commuter train journey from Armyansk to Simferopol extended to 8 hours, and the tourism season, Crimea's economic lifeline, collapsed. Tour companies reported 80% of June reservations were canceled. On social media, Russians are warning each other. If you're planning a holiday in Crimea, return your tickets. Leave before the trap closes. The trap is closing, and Russia cannot stop it. It's running air defense, mobilizing mobile fire teams, and claiming 239 drones shot down. But the hits are real, and the results are evident. Russia's defense efforts are falling short because the problem is not tactical, but structural. Ukraine sends hundreds of drones simultaneously from different directions, and air defense systems are saturated by being forced to track dozens of targets at once. Some drones are shot down, but those that aren't strike critical infrastructure, and every successful hit makes the next one easier. Air defense elements destroyed during these 3 nights opened gaps in Crimea's shield that are difficult to reverse. As one analyst noted, air defense in Kerch had weakened so much that the attack on the oil terminal succeeded. It's also worth remembering there's a bridge in Kerch, and that bridge's defense thins by the day. Moreover, technological asymmetry works against Russia. Ukraine's long-range drones fly at low altitude with minimal radar signatures. Russia's large systems like S-300 and S-400 were designed for high-altitude missile and aircraft threats and struggle to detect small, low-flying drone swarms. Fiber optic cable models completely bypass electronic warfare systems. When there's no signal, there's nothing to jam. And Russia's efforts to close this gap are falling short. OSINT analysts detected on June 19th that Russian mobile fire teams began escorting fuel tankers in Crimea. Protection is needed, but there aren't enough teams to provide it. Air defense capacity is limited, and priority goes to the front. Crimea was built on the assumption of a safe rear, but Ukraine's growing strike capacity collapsed that assumption. Will Russia protect a bridge, the port, the power plant, or the gas infrastructure? It cannot protect all of them at once, and Ukraine is striking all of them at once. But these strikes are not random. They're the final phase of a strategy that has been built for years, systematically isolating Crimea. This strategy's origins date back to the 2023 counteroffensive. That summer, Ukrainian tanks advanced south, trying to break Russia's land bridge, the highway and railway corridor connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland. The offensive failed. Russian minefields, heavy artillery fire, and lack of air superiority stopped the advance. But in 2026, the tables turned. Drones are doing what tanks couldn't. According to Kiev Post's analysis, Ukraine is now rendering the land bridge unusable with drones, rather than physically breaking it. Former U.S. European Forces Commander General Ben Hodges summarized the strategy. First, isolate the peninsula, cut the road to Jankoy, and destroy the bridge. Then make it impossible for Russian forces to stay. And isolation advances in 3 dimensions. At sea, Ukraine's unmanned naval vehicles have been active around Crimea since 2023. Approximately 30% of the Black Sea fleet was sunk or heavily damaged, and the remainder was forced to shelter in Novorossiysk. Ferry traffic in the Kerch Strait is under constant threat, and with Panagia being struck, the last safe sea route also closed. On land, the Azov Battalion declared it has taken control of highways in southern Ukraine with drones. The land corridor has become the road of burning fuel trucks. In the air, Ukraine's systematic attacks on air defense elements are thinning Crimea's shield, and every successful strike opens the way for the next attack. And the Crimea Bridge itself is also gradually deteriorating. In October 2022, a truck bomb collapsed 2 sections of the bridge, requiring months of repair. In July 2023, naval drones closed structural damage. In June 2025, underwater explosives were used. In 2026, heavy vehicle transit across the bridge was banned, and fuel transport was halted for security reasons. The bridge is standing, but its capacity decreases with every attack. Putin opened the bridge in 2018 as a symbol, connecting Crimea to Russia forever. Now that symbol represents the erosion of Russia's capacity to hold Crimea with every closure. Defense Minister Fedorov summarized the formula simply when announcing the logistics lockdown program. The enemy will not feel safe even far from the front. And next-generation AI-guided drones make this formula even more devastating. In the final phase, AI takes over targeting and locks onto the target regardless of electronic warfare or signal disruption. Crimea's isolation is no longer a plan, but a process, and the process is accelerating. The person who explains this best is the commander running that process. Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces Commander Madyar shared not a prophecy, but an operational intent statement about Crimea. Crimea will destroy Moscow. Putin will hold the peninsula to the end because Crimea is Russia's greatest war prize. But according to Madyar, this very obsession is Russia's trap. Every resource spent holding the peninsula is pulled from the front. Every repair weakens defense somewhere else. And every day, Crimea's cost exceeds its strategic value a little more. In Madyar's words, things will never go back to the way they were. And the more resources Russia spends, the heavier the collapse will be. Putin once described Crimea as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Now that aircraft carrier has run out of fuel. And on Russia's side, the first signs of panic are appearing. Among Z-bloggers, Madyar's statement about launching 5,000 drones per day starting July 1st created a shockwave. One Z-blogger summarized the situation. They're going to blockade Crimea, and they want to cut Donetsk too. They want to blockade all roads from the air. Right now they're testing the pulse. This panic is not just military but psychological. Russia's own war supporters are discussing for the first time that Crimea could be lost. Kremlin propagandist Alexander Kotz described the situation as gloomy, and beneath his words was a warning to the Kremlin. The current defense strategy isn't working. War bloggers criticized the army harshly for failing to anticipate the attacks and for their slow response. Criticism is no longer coming from the opposition, but from the regime's own base. Madyar finished his words like this: Crimea will destroy Moscow. This psychological breaking point is hidden right under our noses. All dictatorships collapse suddenly. Today, Moscow's Crimea is falling behind. And he then addressed Ukrainians in occupied territories, advising them to stay away from military facilities. These words show that Ukraine's Crimea strategy has not just a military, but a psychological dimension. The aim is not to physically take the peninsula, but to bring it to a point where holding it is unbearable for Russia. It's heading toward the unbearable point, but thinking Russia will abandon Crimea is premature. The probability of Putin abandoning Crimea is near zero, because losing the peninsula would be not just a military defeat, but a political earthquake that could trigger the regime's collapse. Russia knows this, and adaptation efforts continue. New railway lines are being built through occupied southern Ukraine. Alternative resupply routes via Rostov through Mariupol and Melitopol are being developed. Air logistics came online. Aircraft and helicopters are transporting emergency materials. Expensive and risky, but possible. Russia's repair capacity cannot be underestimated. The Kerch Bridge is still standing despite 3 major attacks since 2022 and was reopened to traffic every time. Crimea's complete isolation has not yet occurred. Ukraine is advancing step by step, but Russia is also responding to every step. Ukraine's capacity to sustain this campaign must also be questioned. Every drone operation requires intelligence, planning, and resources. Launching hundreds of drones over 3 nights is an enormous logistics effort, and this effort is pulled from resources that could be used elsewhere at the front. Russia also has retaliation capacity. Russian attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure continue, and Ukraine's own electrical grid is under pressure. War is not one-sided, and Russia still has cards. How realistic do you think those cards are? Share your thoughts in the comments. We will continue to follow these developments. Subscribe to the Geo Network. Thank you for watching.